Maximinus Thrax, there's this legend behind him that he's 7 foot tall. He's somebody that starts as a very poor person that manages through the legions to eventually become emperor. So there is really this pathway open to them. So there was an ability to start as nobody and use your military career to become somebody as an emperor. There's a pathway open for men that really just isn't there anymore in a lot of ways. And I think the other thing as well is when things aren't going well, we tend to look at past empires and see what happened.
Jeremy, what's up, brother? It's been a long time, but I'm glad you could join me on the podcast today.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate this because I know you've been doing this for a really long time, and I see it as an honor to be here. So thanks for having me, man.
Well, you shared an interesting comment or topic in the email that you sent me last week, and I thought, that actually would be really good. And we're going to talk all things Roman Empire, and I'm always interested in men's fascination, including mine and obviously yours because you've studied this stuff. What would you say is the fascination that men have with the Roman Empire, and why is it that we are so intrigued by it?
Well, I think there's a couple different things you can look at. I think first is that's a time period when men could be masculine, right? That was a really big part of what it was. If you look at how the Roman household is built, the title that's often given to the Roman father is Dominus, which translates from Latin to English meaning Lord. So he's literally the person in charge of his household. So if you look at more of a mid to late Roman emperor, a guy like Maximinus Thrax, there's this legend behind him that he's 7 foot tall, and he's somebody that starts as not quite a slave, but a very poor person that manages through the legions to eventually become emperor. So there is really this pathway open to them. So I think that's one part of it is, I won't say that Rome was very fluid, but there was an ability to start as nobody and use your military career to become somebody as an emperor. Now, if you look at how men often look at civilizations when things aren't doing so well, I think often we look at past civilizations, right? In the Middle Ages, Charlemagne was looking at this, and that's why he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Or if you look at even in modern days, it doesn't really seem like things are doing well here, not just in America, but globally. So I think people often look at empires and what happens with them, right? So I think, to me, if you could look at those two major things, there's a pathway open for men that really just isn't there anymore in a lot of ways. And I think the other thing as well is when things aren't going well, we tend to look at past empires and see what happened.
It seems to me when you talk about a pathway that the pathway is greater than it's ever been. I imagine it's greater than it was during the Roman Empire. What is interesting when you talk about pathway to wealth and abundance through the military, I don't think that's as prevalent anymore. It's typically done through entrepreneurship. Although I will say that there has been a lot of political careers in the higher echelons of the federal government started through military service.
Right. No, I would say that, but I would definitely say as well, if you wanted to compare a lot of Roman generals and powerful people, you could compare them very honestly to CEOs nowadays. Like, for example, Elon Musk is very obsessed with Lucius Sulla, who's a late Republic character. And he's this guy that kind of takes a very unstable republic and tries to put it back together. So I think at the same time, the pathway is a little bit different, but men are looking for something more, because you can even see the feminization of a lot of jobs. Men are being pushed out in certain ways and told you can't be masculine, you can't care for your family. But I think that's also created a really great opening for, those of us that do want to care for our families, that do want to do more for our families, that, are chopping firewood, like those of us important things that for a long time we weren't doing.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think one of the common sentiments that I often hear is that our hands are tied as men.
Yeah.
We can go out and I see this specifically with the economy. I went out and bought groceries over the weekend. I think I took my kids to some fast food place, and it was like me and my two youngest children. It was $45. And not to mention, if I would have done that in DoorDash, it would have been $82. But that alone is, and I think that's a tool. I'm very curious if this was a tool that was used to control the populace during those Roman Empire years, because I think more than I've ever experienced and than I've ever felt is that money and monetary policy is being used to subjugate us in a way that I haven't experienced before and I'm not familiar with in other times throughout our founding.
Well, it's interesting as well, because if you look at 1913 was a very pivotal year for America, because there's kind of three major things that changed that year. First, the Income Tax Amendment. Second, the Federal Reserve Act passes. And then you also have that states are no longer voting for, or that the state legislatures are no longer electing their senators, right? It becomes more of a popular vote. So a lot changes in how the country functions, and monetary policy is a really big part of that, because I think when you look at it, people have the idea that I'm going to go out to the store, I'm going to buy a DoorDash, whatever I'm going to do, and things are just getting more expensive. But that isn't actually the case, right? Like, what's actually happening is every single year, your dollar is losing value. And if you look at, you get car repairs 7 years ago, those car repairs are probably double or close to that of what they were 7 to 10 years ago. And the government calls that something called quantitative easing. That just, in simple terms, means they printed more money, so now your dollar is worth less. And that's, if you look at one of the major things I see in why the Roman Empire fell, it has to do with monetary policy. Now, I don't know that it was a control mechanism, but you could say by 284 AD, they're at 15,000% inflation. So
whoa,
the dollar is losing, the Roman denarius at that point in time is losing so much value, people didn't even want to hold it, right? That becomes a real problem that they'll have, where they're seeing the money, they don't have worth in it. And a lot of that is driven by a couple different things. The first being instability. The 3rd century, there is a lot of instability in who's actually leading this empire. Men would raise an army, declare themselves emperor, and then fight off all combatants that also declared themselves emperor. So you have a real issue with central power. But at the same time, what they're doing with their money is using it to pay the military. And they would double pay, triple pay, quadruple pay, and they would actually clip off people. So for them, inflation's a real tangible thing, right? They would see the coin, they would see it's different. I have some 3rd century coins next to me here. Like, this is a Roman bronze. And you had a coin that was silver, and in the time of Augustus in the 1st century would have been 95% pure. By the time of Aurelian in the 270s, it's 5% pure. And people really would have felt that they were losing their buying power. And if you look at a country or an empire or anything, or a civilization, when people have less confidence in the money, it says a lot about the direction things are headed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask how inflation was introduced, because during those first centuries during the Roman Empire, I can't imagine they can just go print a bunch of money very easily. But what you're saying is the actual makeup of the coin moves from 100% precious metal down to 5%, I think is what you said.
Right. That silver coin is basically bronze by the 270s AD. So over a 300-year period, you'd have kind of your early emperors, the way they would do it is just by spending money, right? Like, you have somebody like Commodus that spends a lot of money, or Nero that spends a lot of money. But after Commodus, you have an emperor named Septimius Severus in 193 AD. And the big thing that he does, that a lot of the military leaders are going to do after him in their path to emperor, is they start clipping off pieces of those coins and then adding other base metals so that the size stays about the same, but the weight's going to change, right? And they would double the pay of the military, triple the pay of the military, and they have to pay those men. So how do you do that but with more coins? So for them, it would have been very tangible and real, where for us, it's just ones and zeros in a computer, and you feel it when you go to the store to purchase something.
The doubling and tripling of the military's pay was just to get them in their back pocket. Correct. To help with political aspirations, correct? Correct.
And you have to understand that the Roman military is changing a lot during this time. So if you look at kind of the early republic, it was a citizen soldiery, where you had citizens fighting to protect their republic from foreign invaders like Carthage and things like that. Towards the late republic, you're going to have major reforms in the military. And one of the major things that happens is it goes from being a citizen soldiery to a professional military. And you're always going to have what's called the foederati, which are barbarian type legions fighting alongside Roman legions. But as you get into the late 2nd and early 3rd century, they're going to start becoming part of the legions, right? So their allegiance isn't to defending Rome, it's to whatever money they're receiving and who can pay them the most. So that's a real problem you start to have. And if you look at the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, you're going to have a barbarian that's a barbarian commander one day and a Roman general the next day. So it's whoever can pay me the most is going to get my allegiance. And as money loses its value, well, there's no sense in being Roman, right? Because it doesn't have a lot of intrinsic value to them and who they're fighting for.
It sounds like almost that these individuals are now mercenaries for hire. I was going to say militia, but I don't think militia quite paints what you're saying.
No, because they would have been, Visigoths, Ostrogoths. They would have been one of these other tribes that the Roman they would be looking for a better life, and that would be the reason they would come to Rome. They don't initially have the idea that they want to topple it, and they could do that through the legions, because as a legion, if you serve for 25 and later 30 years, you could get citizenship at the end of your service. That would mean for your family, your children, whatever it might be, and you could actually be in Roman political position. So there's a real value to that. But what starts to happen is as money loses its value, well, why would I fight for Rome if they don't really have any real power? And that's what you start to see toward the middle of the 3rd century and the 4th century.
So was it Julius Caesar who really started to do this? That's the first instance that I know of, but I'm not really well versed using the military to amass political power. Or did it happen well before that?
It happens well before that. If you want to look at the last 100 years of the Roman Republic, and I think the major thing people don't understand is that Julius Caesar wasn't a Roman Empire character. He's a Roman Republic character. And if you want to just kind of understand what Rome is, it's really 3 eras in time. It's a kingdom in 753 BC, then it's a republic around the year 500, and it becomes an empire around the year 31, right? And it's going to be an empire until it falls in 476. So the way each one of those things functions is very different. So in the last 100 years of the republic, you have what's called the Roman Civil War. Now, it's not a civil war like we would think of civil wars, like North versus South or Democrats versus Republicans. It's really these moneyed classes fighting against each other for who's going to control this territory. So
sounds familiar.
Yeah. In 133, you have 2 brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and they will use the power of the people to basically give themselves more power. People realize that both of them are assassinated a few years apart, and then that mantle is going to be picked up by another Roman general named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And his real idea is using the power of the military. And he's actually the first one to march on Rome. And that really sets a bad precedent, because before that time, that wasn't something that had really happened before. And there's a competition between him and another general named Gaius Marius for basically who's going to control Rome. Marius is often seen as Rome's second founder, since he does these military reforms I was talking about earlier. And Sulla is the guy that comes out on top. And what he ends up doing is the first thing he does is he names himself dictator for life, or dictator perpetually. And it lasts for about a 4-year period from 82 to 78 BC. The dictator office usually lasted for 6 months because Romans thought that one person could come in and solve things, whereas multiple people couldn't agree. So during that period, he does what are called proscriptions. So there are names on a tablet in the forum. Anybody on that forum could be killed, and either the Roman state would get their money and power, or whoever brought them in would get their money and power. So it creates a lot of instability. So that's kind of the first marker, if you want to see where Rome dramatically changes, is these proscriptions and this dictatorship of Sulla. Later on down the road, you're going to have Julius Caesar do something very similar, where it's another civil war type environment, and it becomes the Senate and Pompey versus Caesar. And Caesar's going to come out on top here, mainly because the Senate doesn't really know how to handle this situation, and they continue to push, right? And what I mean by that is, I apologize that I'm kind of skipping around. There's a lot of background information on some of this stuff, but
no, this is interesting stuff.
In Rome, there's 2 key offices that run Rome. They're called the consuls, because Rome didn't believe that one person should hold power, because they innately hated kingship since they were first a kingdom. In 59 BC, Caesar is one of the 2 consuls, and they would hold that office for a year. And
got it.
His co-consul doesn't really have a ton of power. He's actually backed by another Roman politician, and that politician and Caesar not getting along are what really creates what will lead to Caesar marching on Rome. And what's going to happen from that point is, if they were consul, they couldn't stand charges for anything political. Because a lot of times there was this lore around Roman office: your first year you were broke, your second year you'd pay off your debts, and your third year you would be building wealth, right, in Roman office. So a lot of what Romans did in office, in the highest office, could be seen as crimes. So when Caesar wants to be consul again so that he couldn't be charged for things that he did in his tenure being a proconsul in Gaul, you had to appear in person to get voted for. Caesar knew if he appeared in person, he would likely be arrested for these crimes. So he decides, okay, I'm going to basically write Rome and say that I would like to run for office in absentia, which was against the rules. So that law is passed and allows him to do that. But Cato the Younger, who's the politician he doesn't agree with, has that law canceled. So now Caesar really has no choice. And it's this really personal gripe between Cato and Caesar that pushes the fall of the Roman Republic, because Caesar really has no other choice but to cross the Rubicon River with troops, which was not something that would have been acceptable during this time period. Now, what Caesar...
Can I interrupt real quick?
Go for it.
Because the way I'm understanding is that Caesar ran again for political office to avoid being tried and eventually killed for his quote-unquote crimes against the Republic at that point.
Right, and he wouldn't have been killed during that time period. They would have just kicked somebody out of Rome, which would have been a major embarrassment that they can't hold political office because they didn't have the type of political will to really kill people for that. But he would have been removed from Rome, which would have been political suicide. So he has
they didn't have the will to do that. That's interesting. That surprises me.
Not for their top politicians. They might do it for others. And there are certain...
He'd be exiled, though.
Right. There are certain instances where executions do occur, but it was more typical to be exiled, which is more of an embarrassment, that you're still living, but you're never going to see Rome again. So that's a major problem for him, that he feels that he's going to be pushed out of political power and tried and charged in some way. So he's pushed to the point where he has to cross the Rubicon with troops, which that was kind of the barrier in northern Italy, where you were expected to disband your troops and just kind of enter Rome without them. So he was not willing to lose that protection. So when he comes into Rome, Cato the Younger and the Senate actually abandon Rome. So he comes in and just takes over because they leave. And then he just spends the next couple years chasing them down, and Cato's going to commit suicide. Pompey the Great is going to be killed by the Ptolemaic king in Egypt. And then Caesar basically just gets power. And he declares himself in 44 BC dictator for life, this office that was only supposed to last 6 months. This was very strange to Romans. Now, what he was going to do with that is often up for debate, but people had the idea that he was making himself a king. And that is what leads to his assassination. Now, that power vacuum is going to be what the first emperor, Augustus, walks into. And he's Caesar's grandnephew. So he's not somebody that was really important politically, but in Rome, when you died, you could, in your will, give your offices and titles to someone. So when Caesar's will is read, Augustus receives his offices and titles because he's born Gaius Octavius, but he becomes Julius Caesar Augustus Octavianus. And that is really what causes this collapse of a republic into an empire.
Why was that the case when Julius Caesar was killed for potentially turning himself into a king? I think that was the fear based on what you said.
Yeah.
Why would the Senate at that point, or the people, not revert back to the way it was done previously and honor his will to make Augustus, I think is who you said?
Yes.
The first Roman emperor?
So the thing you have to understand is Augustus is brilliant. And what happens during this time period, as I mentioned, they're going through 100 years of civil war. So people hadn't seen stability in a really long time. So when Caesar dies, Caesar's second in command, Mark Antony, and Augustus together go after Caesar's assassins. And after they're taken out of the picture, the two of them actually split the Roman Republic between themselves. And what Augustus does is he's a master of propaganda. So he convinces others that Antony's kind of going Eastern, if that makes sense. And he's living with Cleopatra during this time period. And he creates this real amount of propaganda against Mark Antony during this time period. So what ends up happening then is once Antony is put down after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Augustus around 23 BC says, okay, I'm going to retire. I brought you peace. And these people have been through civil war for 100 years. They actually demand he keep office. So then him being the smart person that he is, he takes the power of several different offices and brings them to himself without calling himself a king. he takes the power of the consul, he takes the power of the tribune, power of the censor, and also the Pontifex Maximus, which is the top priest of Rome. And then he takes this other office. In the Senate, they would have this office called the Princeps Senatus, and it was kind of like their Speaker of the House, the Prince of the Senate. So he calls himself the Princeps. So he's this Prince of Rome, or this first citizen ahead of all citizens. And people didn't really know what to do with that because he wasn't a king. And the word emperor actually comes from imperator, which was the top general of the Roman army, and he takes that title as well. So he creates kind of this mystery around himself of what his new position actually is. And that's why succession for him is very difficult as opposed to other emperors, because what do you describe this guy as? Well, he's the Prince of Rome. And that's really the position they're in, where people had been through civil war for so long. This guy brings them peace. They don't want to go back to war. And well, he's not exactly a king. He's the Prince of Rome. And it becomes something people start to accept.
It is interesting because as you were sharing that, I've studied a little bit with early American history, and you have individuals like George Washington who very much could have become the king of this country.
Yeah,
and the difference here is that he decided to step away and step down from the powers that would have been granted to him, which is really interesting. But other cultures that I've read on. Including, America, like Roman Empire, a little bit, Hawaiian cultures. There's always some sort of consolidation of power through the military, it seems like. And then once that's consolidated, then it's peace. But that consolidation did not come through peace. And it's the same individuals who are saying now we're peaceful are the ones who enacted all these problems in the first place to consolidate this power.
Well, and you could look at Napoleon as a great example of that, right? Like Napoleon comes after the French Revolution. They have this new republic. The office he receives is something called the first consul, which once again comes from the idea of what Rome was. And he gets to a certain point where he gets so much power to himself that he drops the facade and has himself crowned emperor. So it is very interesting that you get men in this position and they want to bring more power to themselves, which is why George Washington is so interesting, because our founding fathers would have studied the classics to a point. They would have understood these things and what had happened in history, right? And there's a character in Roman history that he may have existed, he may not have existed, but we don't know. His name's Cincinnatus, and he's seen kind of as the Roman ideal. Because as I mentioned, the Romans had this idea that though we have two consuls every year, if things aren't going so well, we have to have one person in charge. And that's where that office of dictator is. It would last 6 months and then it would expire. So Cincinnatus takes the office for 6 months, brings peace to Rome, and then goes back to farming. And that's why George Washington was very often called the American Cincinnatus, because he's the same idea. And he would have, there's during his time, there's societies of Cincinnatus and other things that really were enjoying what George Washington was doing. So he would have been aware of a lot of these things. And I think it has a lot of effect on how he acted.
Yeah. I mean, even individuals like, Hitler is another example where it was on the back of World War I, and he spread enough propaganda that said the Germans were being treated unfairly and targeted unfairly after World War I took place, and consolidated that power. And we know the rest of the story. It's really fascinating. How could something like that happen in modern times? It's so hard to imagine. And you have people saying that about Trump, and he's trying to get elected forever. And, I don't really take that seriously, that thought, but it shouldn't be out of the realm of possibility that these things do repeat themselves. Yes. We just can't fathom it would happen.
Well, I'm a big believer in saying history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And I think that's why it's important to see a lot of these things historically and how they could happen. And I think the thing you have to understand is when you get in a situation like that, there's a few things that happen, and you could look at Nazi Germany as this. You could look at the French Revolution as this. You could even look at how things are now. It's when the love for a political individual marries with desperation. That's a really dangerous position to be in. And you have to hope that that person that has power in some ways is a benevolent person that wouldn't do those things, right? So, I've heard a lot of people make those same comments about Trump, but at the same time, I just don't see it. I don't see it because I think they make those comparisons to the late Roman Republic. But if you look at where we are as a country, I think we've ceased to be really a functional republic in a very long time. And I think we are more in an empire stage, because if you even look at the executive office since FDR, the executive has become much more powerful than the other two branches of government. So I think we've been in a position more, and you look at FDR, the number of times he's elected president, right? It was more of that position where desperation and the love for an individual create a situation like that. So I think to say we are a functional republic, though I'd love us to be, we haven't been such in a long time.
Well, okay, so I got a bunch of questions here. So, take Trump as a president. A very polarizing figure, right? Half of the country loves him, half of the country despises him, and there's no in between.
Right.
What was it like during the early stages of the Roman Empire, or even into the latter stages? Was it that divided between the populace, between the citizens? And how did Rome ultimately fall? What was the final nail in the coffin?
So I think the thing you're going to have to look at is who's actually in control. And I think literacy is a really big part of it. And that's one of the things I think separates us now from our history is we are much more literate and much more able to communicate than we were thousands of years ago. So I think that is a big part of it. And that's why such a crackdown happened on social media, right? Because there becomes this free flow of information to the powers that be that's dangerous, no matter who's in power. So if you want to look at how things are in the time of Augustus, there's a very low illiteracy rate. You have about 10% of the population that's literate, and you also have about 10% of the population that's controlling everything. So you have really the ones that have an education are the ones in charge. So I think that's a really big point you have to look at. And for a lot of the powerful classes, well, Rome had a system of a client system. And what that means is you would owe things to a powerful politician, whether it's your own wealth, your own career, whatever it might be. And those clients would actually show up at the home of that person every day and kind of say, hey, what's my job today, boss? I guess very similar to how the mafia would work in a lot of ways. So in that culture, a lot of people would have owed their position to Augustus, right? So it didn't matter if they liked him or didn't like him. They would have wanted to maintain their own position and their family's position. So it's important for them to grant power to that person, right? And the most powerful benefactor you could have would be the emperor. So I think understanding that culturally is a really big difference, is people would have owed their political position, their own wealth, or even their careers to whoever's in charge. So it doesn't really matter if they like him or don't like him. That's where they're getting their power from.
Well, I mean, the same thing happens today. I've often wondered how much dirt politicians have on each other to be somewhat workable together, because if not, I mean, it could go south really, really quickly. And then not to mention, so take this spat between Trump and Elon Musk. And if I understand correctly, and I'm not too well versed on this, but Trump advocated for doing away with some credits available to electric car manufacturers. And of course, that's kind of the impetus for their infighting between, I think, Trump and Musk. But that just goes to show that, of course, Elon Musk is going to fight against that.
Yeah.
And of course, there's political power, especially with lobbyists and everything like that is being wielded against. This is why I don't like corporatism.
Yes,
is for these types of reasons.
Well, you could make a lot of arguments. You could make a lot of arguments on one of the major reasons that Musk turned against the Biden administration is when they were doing electric car things, they were working with Ford and GM, and they were ignoring Tesla, right? So Musk definitely knows where his bread's buttered. And I think if you look at corporatism and how it marries with government, that is a really dangerous position to be in.
Yeah, and then, as you were talking about the literacy rate, I could not help but think of the movie Idiocracy. Have you seen that? I mean,
that's one of my favorite movies where they're putting Gatorade on the plants and they're wondering why they're not growing. They have electrolytes.
Yeah. It does sound a little bit like that, not taken to the degree that movie does, of course, but I also think there's interesting things with social media in general. And we know the algorithms, for example, with TikTok are separate for Americans than they are other parts of the world for exactly that reason. I watched my kids this weekend, and my youngest was on YouTube for a little bit, and he's watching shorts, and he's making a decision within literally half a second. Nope, nope. And I asked him, I said, how do you know you didn't want to watch that? He's like, I don't know. It just didn't look good.
But here's the important point about that, though, Ryan, is I think if you look at attention spans and how they change, people with shorter attention spans are much easier to control, right? And if you look at
absolutely,
because they're not able to look at nuance and look at how things work, and if you even look at our history, history that was written post World War II was some of the best written history that we have, and most people now probably couldn't get through it. Or even you go hundreds of years back, the famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, written by Edward Gibbon in 1776. Most people couldn't get through that because it's very difficult to read. And I think that's a position you get in where literacy rates have changed and also attention spans have changed. And those people are very easy to control.
Well, yeah, there's also the lack of delayed gratification, and I see that with our country's social programs. Heaven forbid a political candidate, a serious political contender, ever says anything about doing away with even changing Social Security and Medicare benefits. But any sane and rational human being who spent any time even just looking at it on a surface level can see that that's a real problem that we are staring down the barrel of. Yeah. But we're not able to delay gratification long enough. We're not able to make these decisions to do something now that would benefit probably our grandchildren. We wouldn't be the beneficiaries of that work. They would.
Well, it takes away your autonomy as well. And this is where I was talking earlier about how a man provides for their family and creates that structure, right? We're losing our autonomy for a lot of social programs. If women get married, they lose those social programs, right? So why would they, right? In a lot of low income areas. Or if you look at how social programs worked in Rome, I mentioned those two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Well, one of the major reform programs they start is what's called the grain dole, meaning that the Roman government for people of a certain class would feed you. And that is a program that Rome is going to have until the mid to late 3rd and then 4th century, where things aren't really doing so well. And then that's going to be something that fuels inflation as well, because one of the things that allows the Roman Empire to rise is something called the Roman climate optimum, meaning from about 200 BC to around 200 AD, they had perfect weather, which allowed for better growing of grapes and olives and grain. And when the Roman Empire itself can't provide for it, well, the annexation of Egypt provides for a lot of that grain. So when the climate changes around 250, the Nile would usually flood every year. And when it flooded, it would make rich soil, and that rich soil would make for grain. Well, the Nile around 250 stops flooding. So now you're going to have grain prices double, triple, quadruple. So now the expense of paying for people eating becomes more, and those people don't know how to provide it for themselves.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I want to go back to the question I had asked about the final nail in the coffin, and it's probably so nuanced that it's difficult to say this was it, and that you'll always hear people say. Well, it's argued
about too. People argue about what it is.
Right. So what would you say it is? If it's not one, maybe it's a handful of things that we really need to be aware of as we continue to, I was going to say progress, but I think it's more of a digression at this point as a country.
Well, I think if you want to, so I guess Edward Gibbon, as I mentioned, he has his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he pinpoints about 200 different reasons. One of those is a personal reason that he's raised Catholic, but then his father wants him to have better political position, so he makes him practice in the Church of England. So he has a big personal gripe with the Catholic Church. So one of the things that he says is, well, because more money was being put to religion and to men not working, well, that's a big part of it. I honestly don't think it has that big of an effect. The things that I look at are first being immigration and border control, because as I mentioned, people were being fed by the Roman government, so that cost is going to go up. Around 211 AD, you're going to have an emperor named Caracalla, and what he actually does is the treasury is bankrupt in that point in time, so he's going to solve that by giving about 30 million people citizenship overnight, because in Rome they could tax their inheritance. So now he has a new way to tax them, but they're also responsible for feeding those people, right? So that's a problem that's going to happen. You have 30 new mouths you have to feed, 30 million new mouths you have to feed, and all the other things that come with it. So inflation is a very big driver of this, and also immigration, because the central power in the 3rd century starts to crumble. You have a very stable empire through the 1st century and the 2nd century, But as I mentioned, these men are raising armies, declaring themselves emperor, and attacking each other. So emperors weren't living very long. You don't have them. If you look at Diocletian from 284 to 305, he rules for 20 years. That was pretty normal in the first century AD. It's not very normal in the third century. So you're going to have emperors ruling for months, a few years, or even a couple weeks. So they don't have a very long time period to live. So central power isn't very strong. So what starts to happen is the empire breaks off into a break-off empire in the west called the Gallic Empire, a break-off empire in the east called the Palmyran Empire, and then you also have barbarians pushing in from the north. So it becomes a real problem of how do we handle all these immigrants, because they don't initially not like Rome. They want to take part in the bounty of Rome. But that relationship is going to continue to change as Rome makes agreements with them and breaks those agreements. So you have this immigration problem, this central power problem, and then as I mentioned earlier, the inflationary problem, where money doesn't have a ton of value. And as the legions and the empire start to become less Roman, and the reason they're there is the money, when the money doesn't have any value anymore, well, they don't have any reason to have an empire anymore. And if you look at the last, I guess, 50 to 60 years after the sack of Rome in 410, the traditional fall of Rome is 476 AD. That last 50 to 75 years, the emperors that are in charge are, you have a few boy emperors that are just children. You have weak old men that are emperors, and they're just controlled by barbarian commanders. And the last barbarian commander in 476 is this guy named Odoacer, and he's controlling the child emperor Romulus Augustulus. And he just basically retires Romulus Augustulus, gives him a pension, and says, "There's no more emperors. I'm king of Italy now." So if you look at how that functions, there really isn't a functioning empire anymore, and they kind of dropped the facade around that time period.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Well, the immigration one is interesting because I think it used to be that even immigration in this country, where you'd have a lot of different cultures who would come in and then they would assimilate to American values. They would integrate and assimilate, and then they would be Americans. Now, immigrants come to this country illegally. They are not citizens, or they even do so legally, and technically they are citizens, but they're not acting American. And you no longer have assimilation. Now what you have is you have in Minnesota, you have mini Somalia.
Yeah.
You know, and Michigan as well. So now we're going to start seeing all these different factions throughout the country. And I imagine that's just going to continue to exacerbate and break us apart even more.
Well, and that's the point I was making earlier about, you know, if they're just there for the money and the things they're getting, if there is no central power anymore, it doesn't matter. So if you look at when Rome is sacked in 410, it's sacked by a Visigoth commander named Alaric. Alaric, in his previous parts of his life, had been a Roman commander, though he had always been a Visigoth. So when he's not getting the position he wants and the money he wants, well, he goes back to his original loyalties of being a Visigoth. So that's the problem you have, is when people aren't culturally part of the society they're in, if the things that they're getting change, well, their loyalties are going to change. And that's why I think, honestly, for any position in American government, you shouldn't be able to be a dual citizen, right? Because if you're serving in a place that you are in charge of a certain place, you shouldn't be also loyal to another country. I don't care what that country is if you're here in America.
I mean, that seems pretty common sense, but I know there's going to be people who hear that. Maybe they're dual citizens themselves, and they're not going to like that idea, but there has to be an American culture.
Yes.
You know, and you hear people say, oh, you know, it's a melting pot, and diversity is our strength. Diversity in and of itself is not strength. If, Jeremy, you and I were rowing a boat, and I wanted to go north, and you wanted to go south, one of us would eventually win. It's diverse in thought, but we're going opposite directions, and it's going to be eventually what's going to happen is one of us is going to kill the other one so we can get to where we want to get.
Well, and I think that also, this could go into the whole argument of even how we advance offices and things now. I think it should be the person that's best qualified to do the job, and we don't really do that anymore. And that goes back to your argument about rowing a boat. If you're the best to row a boat and you're an American, you should row the boat. Now, various different people can be Americans, but I think at the same time, if you live here, your loyalty should be here. I don't care where you came from. You know, my family is from Ireland and Germany and all the different places, but they came here and they became Americans. And I think when you look at that, that would be expected, but it's not just an American problem. You can look at what's happening in France right now, or what's happening in the UK right now. It is a global problem, which makes you wonder, is there something more to it?
Yeah. What about one thing you often hear when people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire is sexual immorality, homosexuality, promiscuity, like these types of things. Is that something that has any relevance or bearing in the fall of the Roman Empire? And obviously we see a lot of that now with transgenderism and things like this in our current culture.
Well, I guess in some ways it's right and in some ways it's wrong. And the reason I say that is if you look at by the time Rome falls, even a lot of the barbarian tribes were practicing different forms of Christianity. So by the time Rome falls in the West, most of those in the empire would have been Christian. After the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 313, Emperor Constantine makes Christianity no longer illegal. And by the time he dies, he will be baptized. Now, it doesn't become the official religion of Rome until 380 under Theodosius the Great. But if you look at kind of before that time period, I really look at the 3rd century as the major problem. And that's where you're seeing the debauchery. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the issues. There's an emperor that comes to mind for me named Elagabalus. And he comes from Syria. He's the priest of a cult called Elagabal. And they worship this conical black rock. And when he comes to Rome, he has a wedding for his black rock to another rock, and everybody's demanded to come. He also was someone that forced the Senate into having these orgies. And he's also marries his hairdresser and puts his hairdresser in charge of the grain supply. He's pulled by a chariot.
That makes sense.
He's pulled by a chariot of prostitutes, and he would advance men in political position by the length of their member. That makes sense. So if you want to look at the mid 3rd century, things really aren't so great. And that's why I put so much attention on the 3rd century. By the time Rome falls, it is becoming a Christian empire, but a lot of its decadence and sin had already brought it to a point where it wasn't doing well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said, decadence. I think when you get to that stage, it makes a man weak and lazy. You know, if he's chasing after power I even think, you know, you hear this a lot, like the idea of a modern day civil war in America. And I can't fathom how that happens, because until we get to the point where we no longer have so much to lose, that won't happen.
Yeah.
It just won't, because people are not going to risk their ideology, whatever side of the aisle it is. Their ideology does not match their comfortable, wealthy lives, even if they're in the lower echelons of the economic status. They still are wealthy by history standards and by the world standards.
Right. But I think also there becomes no reward for doing things the right way, right? Like, and I think that's a real problem as well. If you look at even how government is now, there's probably not a lot of politicians as personal people that you would like or that you could put up as paragons of morality, right? But if you look at kind of, as I mentioned, in the 3rd century, Rome has 2 break-off empires, and they're dealing with barbarian invasions. In the 270s, there's an emperor named Aurelian, and he actually reconquers the West, reconquers the East, puts everything back together. And for the wonderful work he does, he's assassinated. So
right.
You have to look at, there's really no path for, I guess, doing things the right way and being a great man.
What would you suggest that as men, obviously studying history, you said it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That makes sense to me. Being literate on some of these things and knowing I'm not, so I'm just as guilty as anybody else. But having an idea of the way these republics have worked and the way they've fallen, I imagine, is important. But what else can a man do to ensure that we leave this country better for our children and our grandchildren?
Well, I think the pandemic has been a really big part of that in a positive, because it's made a lot of people look at what's actually happening out there and the level of responsibility we have to take. And I think it's a lot of what your show stands for, honestly, that we should be doing. And that's being better fathers, being better in our community, and, practicing our religion, right? I think if you look at kind of one of the biggest things that's happened in the last 50 years is we've become a much less spiritual nation. And a country that is spiritually dead is not one that has much of a future. So I think that's what it really comes down to. And I think education is a really big part of it. My kids are being homeschooled because I'm kind of terrified of what's happening in the school system. So I think as a man, if you're taking responsibility for your small area in the country, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this. I had a conversation with General Mike Flynn about this. I had a conversation with Douglas McGregor about this. And a lot of times people look at kind of the big picture and what's happening in the world and what do we do about the wars and all these other things. But for most people, you're not going to be able to do very much about that. But what you can do is take care of your family, put in the right morals and values in your family, practice your religion, and take responsibility in your local area. And if we're all doing that, and there's a lot of us doing that, well, that's how you save a country.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. We just need to enlist more men into the cause to do good work, protect, provide, preside. Obviously, I agree with that sentiment. Jeremy, this has been fascinating. You are a wealth of knowledge when it comes to all of this stuff. It was really interesting to talk about it. I've studied very, very little, and I learned a lot today. So I appreciate you. How did the guys connect with you, learn more about what you're up to, and follow up on the conversation?
Yeah, and I would definitely say I'm not the most educated on Rome out there, but I'm always trying to fill in my educational gaps. So there's a couple courses out there I'd recommend. I know the Great Courses has some great things in the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. One of my favorite is by a guy named Gregory Aldrete. I think he does a great job. But if they want to find out more about me, my personal website is jeremyryanslate.com. I also run a company called Command Your Brand, and we help our clients to appear on some awesome podcasts as well. So if you're somebody out there that you don't want your empire to decline and fall like Rome, if you head over to commandyourbrand.com, we have a great brand authority analysis you can fill out, and that'll show you how you're doing and kind of where your gaps are. So that's commandyourbrand.com.
Awesome. Great segue, by the way. Impressive.
I've been doing this for a long time, man.
Yeah, and we've known each other for a while, so it's good to get you on the podcast and have this conversation. We're going to sync it all up for the guys to get a hold of you and learn more and hopefully save this country. That's the goal.
Yeah, I agree.
Thanks, brother.
Yeah.